live stream tonight, and this later will go up on YouTube. And it's a pleasure to be able to speak to you all and also speak to the people out in the digital world who are watching this. I was saying when some of you walked in, this is like a nasty-looking crowd tonight, and I really like that, and I appreciate that, because I can assure you we're not going to be hugging or exchanging pleasantries or doing any of the things that you might be accustomed to at New Age workshops. This is going to be a serious discussion, a useful discussion, and a very blunt discussion. And I really want to thank Alchemist Kitchen for welcoming me and for hosting this workshop, because I can assure you there are places and venues that did not want to host a workshop called Satanism, the Dark Alternative. And I also had lots of people who came to me and urged me to change the title, to soften it. And my response was no, because I want to be absolutely blunt about what I'm talking about tonight. And we are here to talk about and to explore historical, spiritual, and philosophical Satanism as a practical path. And I want to be very, very clear about something. When I use the term Satanism, I'm not using that as a metaphor for the shadow or for, come on in, for something indirect. I'm speaking very plainly and very directly about the veneration and the worship, ethically, spiritually, of the figure historically known as Satan or Lucifer, who appears in many myths throughout the world, Western and Eastern, under different names. But we in the West often use the Hebrew-derived name Satan, or a Latin term, Lucifer or Lightbringer. I don't, I should say straight out, make a distinction between those two entities, Satan and Lucifer, although I'm very aware that some people do. And I have friends in certain magical orders and certain esoteric orders to whom it's important that they use the term Lucifer, which they sort of see as a more productive, non-maleficent use of the term to refer to some adversarial force. And I respect that entirely. But for me, I don't think it's a philosophical necessity. I don't think one needs to apologize for using those terms, but one does need to be clear. So I've offered you a definition that is very plain, that when I use the term Satanism, I am talking about veneration of Satan. But, come on in, what is Satan? You know, that's the key rub. That's what causes the friction. That's what causes the controversy. That's what causes people to send me these flaming comments over email and on YouTube and so on. What is Satan? And that's going to be the crux of what we try to consider tonight, because my contention is that our definitions of the Satanic and of the Luciferian in the West, by and large, are completely insufficient. There is an esoteric interpretation, an esoteric history behind the Satanic that I think the mainstream culture overall has failed to appreciate. Very often when people come and they say, well, Satanism is just synonymous with evil or violence or destruction or cruelty or lies, my first question is, where are those premises from? Are you drawing that from entertainment? Because there are lots of terrific movies like The Exorcist and The Devil's Reign and so on and so forth that we can talk about, but those things are entertainment. They're not informed by any definitions that I have to organize my moral life around. They're terrific, but so is what I had for dinner last night. That doesn't mean it dictates how I'm going to organize my life as an ethical being, as a creative being, as a productive being. Then the other subset of people will say, well, my definitions come from Scripture, which is more often the case. But do they? Do they come from Scripture? Because references to the Satanic in Scripture are very brief, very fleeting, and often very ambiguous. For example, the most famous, of course, is the story of the serpent supposedly seducing Eve in Genesis 3 and 4. And it lands us all into the shithole that we live in today, supposedly. That Eve eats fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, gives it to Adam, who didn't need any apparent coercing at all. She didn't really seduce Adam. She just said, here, try this. And he said, okay. And then God rains down hell on humanity thereafter. Well, that's one line of reading the story. There's never any statement, in fact, that the figure of the serpent is Satan or is demonic or is anything of the sort. We don't know what it is. It's only later on that some of the writers in the Hebrew tradition and then later writers in the New Testament tradition began to use the Hebrew term Satan or adversary as synonymous with the serpent. And really, you can comb through Scripture. There's just a handful of references to that supposed maleficent force, fleetingly in Isaiah, fleetingly in the book of Revelation, the serpent fleetingly in Genesis, very brief mention in Job, in the Gospels. So if you were to actually take all the references from Scripture that are conventionally thought of as defining of the Satanic, of the Luciferian, you'd come up with maybe about 100 sentences total. And most of those would be clothed in ambiguity, would be the subject of debate. For example, Eve is supposed to have eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Well, it's not even clear to biblical scholars whether the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life, both of which are referenced in Genesis, are two distinct things or are one and the same thing. Wouldn't that be extraordinary if the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life were both one and the same thing? And what kind of life were Adam and Eve conscripted to in so-called paradise, in the Garden of Eden, from what threads we have of this Western creation myth? What kind of life? They had no knowledge of good and evil. They didn't create. They didn't produce. Yes, it's also true that they didn't have friction. Eve ate from the tree. They were expelled from Eden. They begat two sons, Cain and Abel. And by the way, we're all descendants of Cain, if one follows the mythical storyline. And differences had been introduced into the world. And Cain acted out in anger at his brother, with whom he had deep differences. His brother was pious and theological and favored by God. Cain was independent, a loner, a rebel. Wasn't suited to worship, to genuflection, to bowing. And his brother, who he loved, he had deep differences with because their mother and father, so the myth goes, had eaten from this tree of good and evil. And Cain did something that he regretted for the rest of his life. He acted out in violence against his brother without intending to, having acted in passion, slew his brother and paid for it the rest of his life. And yet at the same time, mythically, we're descendants of Cain. We're descendants of Cain. If a knowledge of good and evil had not been introduced into the world by this so-called Satanic or Luciferian force, then not only would there have been no differences between Cain and Abel, but in a very distinct sense, there would have been no Cain and Abel, because everything and everyone would have been classified by a certain sameness. What would be the purpose of creation in the absence of distinctions, of measurement, of production and counterproduction, and yes, of human friction, which inevitably comes out of that. Seen from a different perspective, and I think through history there has been a slender, slender thread of people up through our own time who have very brilliantly read a different perspective into this foundational Western myth. Seen from a different perspective, the serpent was the great liberator of Eve. The serpent was the emancipator of Eve. And I can tell you, there were many, many feminists in the 19th century and others during the Romantic era. There's a seat up here if you're looking. There were many feminists in the 19th century and even during the Romantic era, sort of early proto-feminists that kind of prefigured our contemporary use of the term, who did, in fact, as artists, as rebels, as political agitators, claim Satan as their kind of philosophical grandfather, because they saw Satan in league with certain readings in romantic literature and anarchistic literature, not as the enemy of humanity, but as the rough liberator of humanity. And there were certain romantic poets, including Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, and kind of as a precursor to them, William Blake. Who identified with the figure of Satan as the actual creator of humanity, not as a biological fact, but as an intellectual fact, as the forebringer of the arts, of the sciences, of the individual who rejected conformity, who rejected that which was just given or which was handed out. And you can find a fascinating kind of esoteric storyline that runs through parts of Western culture. The Romantic poets that I've just mentioned are a particularly powerful expression of it, and I'm going to talk about some others, in which Satan is seen not as the seducer of Eve, but as one who brought truth, as one who actually brought truth. Because, and again, if you look at these few lines in Genesis 3 and 4, which sort of have come to form the whole moral foundation of our lives, because Satan actually told Eve the truth. Satan said, "What kind of a God is it who wants to keep you from your intellectual potential, who wants to keep you from making the same distinctions that he makes, that his angels make, but that you are supposed to be kept in a darkened form from? What kind of God would plant a tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the tree of life, the two being synonymous, in the midst of your paradise, but tell you that you can't eat it? What kind of paradise is that? What kind of God would tell you that if you eat from the tree, you'll die? None of these things are true." So said the serpent to Eve. And as it turns out, the serpent was telling the truth. They did not die. They did gain knowledge of good and evil. The fruit apparently tasted good, because for all this storyline that exists for millennia in our culture, Eve didn't seduce Adam into eating the apple. That's not in the story. For millennia, women have been treated as these sneaky counter-truthful figures subjected to horrific persecution during the witch craze, which persisted in Western and Eastern Europe for centuries, based on this unschooled premise that Eve seduced Adam. But in fact, Eve simply offered him the fruit, and he ate of it, and he possessed knowledge. And she was no longer just some kind of physical adjunct to him, created out of his rib, but was a thinking, dynamic, choice-driven individual. Which is why when feminism, anarchism, socialism, other causes that formed kind of the radical body politic began to bubble up in the early to late 1800s, there were many radical figures, artists, political rebels, and so on, including the Romantic poets, who selected Satan as their kind of political forefather, as their central philosophical figure. So when I say that Satanism is the veneration of Satan, and I want to be very direct and straightforward, that is what I'm saying. I'm not trying to hide from that. The urgent question, of course, is, well, what is Satan? What is Satan? Again, we have definitions from entertainment, and we have definitions from the standard Western storyline, but we also have an esoteric insight that I've just been very briefly describing that reads a whole different story into the myth of Satan. And myths are, of course, repositories of great truth. People from all over the world, throughout all time, have codified psychological insights, metaphysical insights, insights into human nature, into myths. A myth may not be historically true, but it is ultimate truth. We all look at the myth of Icarus, for example, who flew too close to the sun and fell to earth. We all know intrinsically, of course that contains a great verity. Of course that contains a great truth. Our greatest truths are located within myths. So I don't use the term myth as a synonym for falsehood. Myth is a parable of truth. A parable of truth. It can also contain great spiritual truth, which I'm going to get to in a moment. So the fact that our creation story here in the West, and in other cultures too, begins with this idea that somehow the first man and woman had existed in this state of suspended judgment that was called paradise, and something that is equated with the satanic came along, and suddenly they were individuals who were thinking, who were choosing, and yes, who were also suffering. I think that within that myth exists great human truth, and I would say spiritual truth as well. When I say spiritual, I mean something extra physical. The basis of my belief system is that there is something that goes beyond the physical. Not everyone who claims the name of Satanist agrees with me and feels that way. Many of my friends in the Church of Satan, which was the organization founded by Anton LaVey in 1966, Anton died in 1997, I have tremendous respect for him. Many of the people within the Church of Satan, not everyone, really believe that Satan is a kind of metaphor for the highest potentials of the human will. They would not agree with me that there's a non-physical, extra-physical aspect to life. There's another organization that was founded by a very brilliant man named Michael Aquino. He broke off from the Church of Satan in 1975. He founded an organization called the Temple of Set. And Aquino's perspective is more of an occultic Satanism. You have, perhaps today, you could say, generally speaking, there's a materialist Satanism, which views Satan as a kind of allegorical character, and there's an occultic Satanism, which views Satan as an actual force that can be appealed to. My sympathies, frankly, are more in the direction of the occultic Satanism, because I do believe in the existence of extra-physical forces, and I'm going to say more about that in just a moment. But I also believe that both those paths, at least in my perspective, I don't think they run parallel. I think they converge. I think they converge at a certain point. Because the truth is, we're always using terms here in the West to describe things that we can't see but that feel very palpably real to us. Show me the ego. Show me consciousness. Show me awareness. Show me inner. Show me outer. Show me personality. Show me essence. These are all just terms that we attach to experiences. We generalize. We arrive at a general consensus about them. And we more or less roughly agree what they mean. I can't prove to you that there's an afterlife. I can't prove to you that some kind of non-physicality exists. I could probably talk about ESP experiments and other things that point us in that direction. I could probably talk about some things in quantum physics that are very suggestive that the mind or that human awareness is a palpable force that goes beyond the local. But I'm not going to be able to demonstrate to you that there's some non-material existence, although that's my very, very strong instinct. So the fact is, whether one has a material outlook, whether one has a theistic outlook, neither of these are barriers to entry, I think, in the conversation that we're having tonight. I think they converge. But I do feel that I should be clear with you that my personal orientation probably lies more in the direction of an occultic Satanism, because I do believe that there's a non-physical approach to life that can complement the physical. And that's very important to me for the following reason. I'm interested in all kinds of metaphysical philosophies. I'm interested in New Thought or mind metaphysics. I'm interested in a very wide variety of different outlooks, and all of them are oriented towards heightening the individual's abilities through some kind of appeal to forces that go beyond motor function, that go beyond cognition. I think that we face tremendous frictions and difficulties in life, all of us, all of us. We have things in our past that are cripplingly difficult. We have things within us that we seem to be unable to find an antecedent for. You can be in therapy all your life and talk and talk and talk, and there are still certain aspects of character that seem to elude analysis. And sometimes the individual just feels broken down. And I do believe there is some modicum of invisible help at such moments. That's been my personal experience. That's been the testimony and experience of countless numbers of sensitive people over millennia. We're broken and we're driven to our knees sometimes by psychological, emotional, physical difficulties. Circumstances batter us down. But I do believe that we are not completely bereft of assistance. I don't think we've been entirely set loose on an ocean of circumstance. But I was brought to a question about this, which is really what brought me here tonight. And I want to put that question to all of you. And it's a question just for you to hold. This isn't something that you have to disclose or talk about. You certainly don't have to talk about it here. As those of you who know me know, I'm very much in opposition to the kind of forced intimacies that exist within the New Age subculture. You don't have to say hi to the person next to you, or hug one another, or answer embarrassing questions. This question is an intimate question, and it's just for you. It's for you to take home with you tonight. It's for you to hold over the next week or whatever period of time is meaningful to you. I wish for you the same thing that I wish for myself, which is that this question becomes one of the most pivotal and meaningful in your life. I'm not exaggerating, because I would never exaggerate to people who have come and given me their precious, precious time for this fixed period that we have together. This question, which I'm going to put to you, could be, the truth is, it could be the most pivotal of your life. Everything in your life could seem to you as a kind of before and after, pivoting on the axis of this question, which I'm going to put to you in just a moment. William Blake, just as a very short preface, wrote a very beautiful work that I'm sure some of you know, a work of kind of epic verse and a portfolio of paintings called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which appeared in 1790. And in this work, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, he has a kind of a list of hell's proverbs, and it's very interesting, and it's really worth reading. And you can find it online tonight, and it's really clear and really straightforward. It makes very exciting, stimulating reading. It's quite short. One of the maxims that Blake uses in this work, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, is this. The same law for the ox and the lion is oppression. The same law for the ox and the lion is oppression. I think in this work, Blake was trying to, among other things, validate the existence of polarities in our lives. In other words, the marriage of heaven and hell. And along those lines, I was struck by a thought several months ago, which is really what brought me to this inquiry and brought me here tonight. And the thought was in the form of a question, which I was referring to, which I now put to you. And I ask you to listen to this very, very carefully, regardless of whether it squares fully with your vocabulary, your perceptions, your language. Don't get hung up on language. Just hear the essence of what I'm going to put to you. It's very simple. What if you're praying to the wrong God? What if you're praying to the wrong God? What if there's an extraordinary wellspring of help for you as an artist, as a person who just wants to get things done in the world, which to me is sacred, and you might be able to avail yourself of that help by turning on its head the spiritual maxim, "Thy will be done," to its satanic opposite, which is, "My will be done. My will be done." And what if there is a force out there? Call it Satan, call it Lucifer, call it whatever you please. We live by myths. I use those terms. A force that can be appealed to on your own terms. You don't have to join anything. You don't have to pay anybody. You don't have to declare yourself a member of anything if you don't feel like it. I'm not a member of anything. I don't recruit for anything or anybody. This is all in the sanctity of your own private life, with rituals, prayers, maxims, affirmations, reading, exploration that you devise. Because I'm telling you, there is a counter-tradition that you can find in the form of very precious threads and fragments of what I think of as a really illuminated satanic tradition. Just threads and fragments that you can find, research, look at, and use to your own ends. What are your ends? You have things you want to accomplish in life. I believe that's the highest sacred expression that a human being can make. Many of you in this room are artists. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Many of you in this room, well, all of us, we're in relationships. We have financial lives. We have creative lives. We have things that we want to do. What do you want to do? What do you want to do? Eve didn't want to just sit around all day barefoot in a garden. She made a decision. She made a decision. And she became an extraordinary individual in so doing. She's the heroine of Genesis, as far as I'm concerned. And yes, there was pain as well. There was pain as well. Something I wish for no one. But friction did enter into the world. Now, as I'm describing this to you, I can already picture the emails that are just piling up in my email box from the people who are watching, out in cyber world. If you do this, you're going to get possessed. You're going to give yourself over to the dark side. Don't listen to this guy. Haven't you seen The Exorcist? That's based on true events. Da, 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 da. Yeah. I must tell you, I take people's ethical objections very, very seriously. I'm not a glib person. I care very, very deeply about people's ethical lives. And if somebody comes to me with an ethical argument, I want to hear it. But I have found that the key foil of human nature, the key brokenness within human nature, is this ever-persistent drive to tell other people what to do. And when people object to your spiritual or ethical or artistic or individual path, most of the time, they don't want to be heard. They want to be heeded. They want you to listen to them and do what they're telling you to do. They don't want you to hear them. They want you to heed them. And that's where all the conflicts begin. Quite frankly, most people couldn't care less what you do. They don't care, as long as you're doing what they want you to do. They don't have an ethical position. They don't have a religious position. People get so angry, they start off preaching Christianity, the central teaching of which is love your neighbor and love your enemy. So if Satan is the great enemy or the great adversary, following from a Christian perspective, you're in exactly the right place. But quite frankly, and you've seen this all the time on social media and other places, people start out arguing from a Christian perspective, and the moment they detect resistance in you, the moment you answer back or you have a counter-argument, they're furious. And I'm not picking on Christians at all. It's human nature. It's me, it's them, it's all of us. People don't usually walk around with ethical or principled positions. They walk around wanting to tell you what to do, and you do not have to listen to them. So, again, but I promised you I wasn't going to be glib, and I'm not going to be. People tell me all these stories. Well, if you read Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible, it will open you to possession and blah, blah, blah. I have to tell you very frankly, and I say this as a friend, I'm not the least bit frightened of that. I am not the least bit frightened of that. The only thing that scares me, frankly, is that my search or your search will not produce anything. I don't want to live in a world where there's no Bigfoot hiding in the woods. I want Bigfoot to be hiding in the woods. What I'm scared of is that maybe there is no Bigfoot hiding in the woods. And I have to contend with that. I don't want to live in fantasy. Maybe the materialists are correct. Maybe there is nothing other than flesh and bone, and the mind is just a localized phenomena driven by the gray matter of the brain. That scares me. I want to live in a world where things go bump in the night, and it's not just my neighbor Liz upstairs hammering a picture into the wall at 4 a.m, And I will say this. Look, in the past several years, and this is a fact, the Vatican has more than quadrupled, the number of exorcists, that is to say Vatican-certified exorcists here in the United States. It's gone from something like 12 to 50. And this has been more widely reported in Great Britain than it has in America. everybody in Great Britain is like, what's going on in America? Why are there so many exorcists being certified? I've never witnessed what I consider a possession, a demonic possession. I have never, personally speaking, I've never met anyone who related such a story to me who I felt I was ready to hand my absolute trust over to. I don't deny, and I would never deny, that it's a strange world that we live in, and there's a lot of strange things going on out there that we have only the foggiest notions or ideas of. So I would never present to you some sort of a rejectionist analysis of that, but I will say the following. I will offer you the following observation. Historically speaking, in the history of religion, in the history of religious literature, and in most of the stories that people tell and pass around, including stories that you'll happen upon online and that people will be emailing me about later tonight when they should be sleeping or doing something productive, most of the time, people who claim to have experienced some sort of demonic possession or something like that were not seeking the devil, were not seeking Satan. Usually they were either very religious people or they were just innocent bystanders, and something tragic and chaotic happened to them. Whereas what literature exists apropos of the tradition that I'm talking about involves people who are actively seeking Satan, who are actively seeking the Luciferic, the Satanic, the so-called dark side. Yes, the dark side. The womb is dark. The night sky is dark, which allows the human eye to see the cosmos. We wouldn't be able to see it without it. The dark is nurturing. If you've ever had trouble sleeping, you know full well that ambient light is disruptive. We need the dark. So those of us who go looking for the dark, looking for the satanic, looking for the Luciferian, there's very, very little record of that individual, because there are very few such individuals, who describe some sort of possession or some sort of negative encounter. It's almost always, such as the literature is, the bystander. And yes, there's all kinds of stories of, my kid started listening to Ozzy Osbourne and then he got possessed and so on. Frankly, Ozzy's a Christian, first of all, and that's a fact. Black Sabbath is a Christian band. I love Black Sabbath. But, I mean, they are a completely and always have been Christian band. I don't know why Ozzy calls himself the Prince of Darkness. Like, you know, it's like saying Pee Wee Herman is the Prince of Darkness. I mean, you know, Ozzy's a Christian and a great musician. I don't believe those stories. I think they're propaganda. I think they're the lowest kind of urban legendary, because they seek to proscribe the human search. And that, to me, is evil. You know, where's the role of ethics within a satanic or a Luciferian outlook? The role of ethics is this. To me, really the only evil and the ultimate evil is proscribing or limiting or violating another individual's pursuit of his or her highest potential. Anything that visits a kind of forced limits onto an individual, whether because of their community, where they come from, who they are, how they identify themselves, or just because they're an isolated and vulnerable individual, anything that visits limits on the development of the individual, to me, is an act of violence. It could be physical violence, or it could be emotional violence, or it could be political violence, what have you. I don't believe in anything that limits the right of the individual to explore his or her highest human potential. That, to me, is the ethic of Satanism. That, to me, is the Luciferian ethic. You don't do something that's going to prescribe or limit another person's self-development or another person's search. I think there are other ethics that one could speak of as well. One could speak of loyalty. I think loyalty is almost a lost virtue in our time. I think loyalty is a word that we should be using more of. And of course, whenever you say that, people always say, well, what do you mean? What if you work for Hitler? Should you be loyal to him? And, I object to those kinds of assumptions because the truth is, most of us, most of the time, in our day-to-day lives, never really confront questions of ultimate evil. Everybody always wants to take every ethical or philosophical discussion to this ultimate degree. And, you're always like 2 degrees separated from Hitler in whatever discussion you have in the 21st century. But the truth is, do I encounter that on a day-to-day basis? Does my neighbor Mike encounter that on a day-to-day basis? No. It's more a question of what level of decency and value and integrity do you demonstrate to your own friends? If you promise somebody that you're going to help them move, well, show up to help them move. If somebody is suffering, don't engage in gossip, which I think is the most poisonous thing that we do to ourselves and to other people about that individual. Loyalty is a primal ethic that we've lost sight of these days. And yes, if you encounter corruption, there's other ethical questions that come in. But the kinds of corruption that we encounter most of the time are usually quite petty. And frankly, they're usually, corruption, to my mind, is usually self-generated. It's taking pleasure or entertainment at seeing somebody else humiliated or seeing somebody else in reduced circumstances or gossiping about somebody. We spend unbelievable amounts of time gossiping. And if you've ever gone to lunch with somebody or gotten together with a friend and spent, an hour and a half, 2 hours gossiping, I will almost bet that you've had the experience of feeling like physically drained afterwards, almost feeling like you're suffering a hangover or like you've eaten too much of something bad for you, like too much sugar or too many carbs. And then you experience this come down where you feel sluggish and slow and depressed, and you might even feel like a sense of ennui or sadness. Gossip is bad for you. It's disloyal. Never engage in it. It's poison. So I think there are satanic ethics. Loyalty is one. Keeping your word is one. And the highest is not doing anything that would deny another person his or her reach for their own highest potential and human possibility. I think that's the central ethic. I want to recommend a couple of things for you to read if you feel like this journey is one that you want to take. And again, I don't belong to any organization. I'm not recruiting for any organization. And I'm simply encouraging this as your own anarchistic path of exploration. Michael Aquino, who is the founder of the Church of Set, who's a Temple of Set, who's a very brilliant man, longtime Satanist, retired lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. He made a fascinating observation, which I think holds true for everybody in this room. He said, when you go down a path like this, you're dedicating yourself to a kind of self-development, and it gives you a kind of anarchistic quality, which makes you less likely to want to belong to an organization. So it's very difficult, in his observation, to maintain a satanic organization because its success mitigates against itself. As soon as people start finding things, they want to leave, or they want to become the leaders, or they want to be put in charge. And as a brilliant man, his response to that is, well, bravo. I mean, if we need to be a small organization, we'll be a small organization, because the mark of success is that nobody can be contained by it. So I say that not only in tribute to him as a great intellect, but to underscore the fact that this path is exquisitely your own. If what I'm describing is appealing to you, write your own prayers, do your own experiments, do your own liturgy. You don't have to get out chalk or that blue non-adhesive tape that painters use and put a pentagram on the floor of your apartment and scare your roommate, although you're very welcome to. The pentagram is a very powerful, beautiful symbol of great, great antiquity, and many Satanists find it very alluring. I certainly do. But what I'm really trying to say to you is this is a path that's entirely your own. It's entirely self-devised. I would recommend to you, first of all, read the book of Genesis, which I was talking about earlier. Read Genesis 3 and 4. My gosh, it's so brief it could be fit on the back of a cocktail napkin. And see what you make of this creation myth, of the serpent supposedly seducing Eve. John Milton took those few lines and he made them into his epic Paradise Lost. And Paradise Lost was a book with which Western culture for a long time was very uncomfortable. It was banned in Tsarist Russia for generations because the first 2 or 3 chapters, which I think are the most alluring in the whole book, the first 2 or 3 chapters present Satan as this kind of heroic rebel who's vanquished, who's defeated, but who rouses his defeated troops from this lake of fire in hell, arranges them into this kind of grand council called the Pandemonium, or House of Demons, and urges them to rise up, set themselves to a new task, determine how they're going to create a new world in their vanquished state. And he says famously, Lucifer says famously, the mind is its own place. It can make a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven. Satan was an optimist. He spoke of the positive thinking tradition. And John Milton, out of these few fragments that exist in the first couple of chapters of Genesis, created this extraordinary story of Satan's conquest and resurgence and existence. You'll discover when you read Paradise Lost again as an adult, as many people have discovered, that the only time the book is really arousing and really thrilling are those chapters that involve Satan. Chiefly the first 2 or 3 chapters of the book. It's absolutely heroic. It's like watching West Side Story when the Jets and the Sharks are on screen. It's fascinating and thrilling. And then when Tony and Maria are on the screen, it's actually very boring, And it's kind of this letdown, although Natalie Wood was magnificent. I think Richard Beamer has done better work. But if you read that book, pay special attention to those first 2 or 3 chapters. They're extraordinary. John Milton created this entire new window on Western life in those first couple of chapters. Read them. Read William Blake's Marriage of Heaven and Hell. You can find it online tonight. It's all of 30 pages. It's very stimulating reading, very simple reading, very straightforward. Probably the most beautifully straightforward thing he ever wrote. Read the Proverbs of Hell. If you're looking for ethics, and if you say to yourself, well, gee, this is alluring, and this is inspiring, and this is interesting, but, I'm an ethical being. And if I'm walking away from the conventional religious traditions, where are my guardrails? Well, read William Blake's Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Read Hell's Proverbs. Those are your guardrails. Those are your guardrails. He lays out a brilliant, brilliant set of ethics that you can read and live by and abide by and still turn on its head the maxim, thy will be done, to my will be done, and be an ethical being. Most especially, and I say this personally, I say this subjectively, read Lord Byron's play Cain. Read Lord Byron's play Cain. You can find it free online, or you can buy a 99-cent Kindle version. It's extraordinary. It's the Cain and Abel story told from Cain's perspective. and Lucifer appears as a very alluring, very powerful character. And he talks about, Lucifer speaks to Cain about how only he can understand the situation of the vanquished individual, of the suffering individual, of the person who lives in the dust, because he has been there. And he challenges a God who preaches love but would conscript those who go beyond his parameters of acceptable behavior to eternal suffering, to damnation. And he disputes, Lucifer speaking to Cain, disputes that he was the serpent or that the serpent was possessed by a demon. He says rather, this was Eve's decision. This was Eve's decision to violate an absurd order against eating from an illumined tree placed directly in the midst of the garden. And who created this tree? Who created this tree? God, who demands total obedience and sacrifices of animals. And of what purpose is it to sacrifice a baby lamb to this mighty figure who put a tree into a garden of illumined knowledge that wasn't supposed to be tasted? So in Lord Byron's play Cain, I think he elevates Eve's decision. He elevates rebelliousness. He speaks to Cain of the sanctity of nonconformity, of non-obedience. And yet, of course, Cain kills his brother, as I was speaking about earlier. The tree of knowledge of good and evil in our Western mythical structure did introduce choice and possibility and ideology and ethics into the world, but it also introduced friction. The tree was a polarity, and Cain and Abel became hung up on this polarity. Cain was the rebel, the nonconformist, the malcontent. Abel, as you'll see in the play, and you can see in the book of Genesis, was the religionist, the moralist, the follower. He wasn't completely innocent because he had a way of life that he wanted Cain to conform to. And Cain had a way of life that said, leave me alone, get away from me. And friction ensued. And Cain, to his everlasting sorrow, as you'll see in the play, killed his brother. So what I would ask you is this. And I ask myself this question as well. When you read this play, Cain, by Lord Byron, and it's very stimulating reading, very short, very accessible. I urge you to read it. Put yourself in Cain's position and ask, was there some other possibility? Was there some other way? Was there some manner of life that Cain could have adopted to defend himself without resorting to violence? It's a question. Maybe not. Maybe they were just caught in this inevitable existential struggle. They had differing point of views, and it erupted into violence. It's the human tragedy. But what would be the alternative? The play asks, look, had Eve never eaten from the tree, the alternative would be there really would not be a humanity to speak of. How would humans be even deserving of the plural case, humans? There would really just be one consensus-based, averaged-out humanity that I don't think we could even recognize and wouldn't recognize ourselves within. But it's interesting to read that play because it presents Lucifer as a heroic figure but it does not try to elude or escape the tragedy that eating the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil introduced into the world in the form of the fratricidal murder. But read it. It's there to be read. Put yourself in Cain's position and hold the question. Is it possible to live a life of self-defense that doesn't involve violence, that doesn't involve encroaching on another person? We're human. We're descendants of Cain, whether we like it or not. Abel had no bloodline. He was gone. So we're descendants of Cain. So ask. Your four parents, in a very real sense, are Eve and Cain. What would you have done? What would you have done? This is a private journey for you to go on. It's not congregational, and you don't have to tell anything to anybody. But it's something to explore. Another work that I would read, which you can also find online, is a short book called The Diabolicon by Michael Aquino. Aquino, who I mentioned earlier, is the founder of the Temple of Set. He's the guy who says that when a satanic organization is successful, it ceases to exist because everybody just goes off and does whatever they want. And I thought it was actually a rather brilliant observation. How can you contain a bunch of individualists in some sort of an organizational structure in perpetuity? It's difficult. But I'm being partly facetious. He's a brilliant man, and I don't in any way mean to subtract from his accomplishments because I venerate him. He wrote a book called The Diabolicon in which he retells the entire myth that is found in the most fleeting lines in the book of Revelation and a few other places, mostly metaphorical allusions, to there being this war in heaven and Satan and his legions being expelled from heaven. The Diabolicon is a short book that re-envisions and repictures, according to Aquino's brilliant insights, and I think high, uniquely extraordinary insights, he re-envisions and he repictures this friction between what he would describe as a kind of passive, hypocritical conformity represented by the figure of God and his legions, and a radical, unbending individualism and wish for growth and development and becoming, represented by Lucifer, Satan, and his forces, and how these two clash and how they come into contact and how there's a falling out. And the Diabolicon is a very interesting book. And again, you can find it online quite easily. You put in Diabolicon and Aquino in Google. It's not going to take you to Kentucky Fried Chicken. You will find it. It's a very interesting book because Aquino suggests that if you so wish to devise some sort of an appeal or a petition or a prayer to the satanic, you don't have to do so in some dramatic way on bended knee or through genuflection, or again, create some sort of a histrionic ritual. But you speak to the satanic, you speak to the figure represented as Satan, as a friend, as a colleague, as an equal, because this figure wishes for your development, wishes for your productivity, did not deceive Eve, but emancipated Eve. And you speak to this figure as a friend. These are just some reading choices for you to look into. They'll stimulate ideas in you. I mentioned briefly another organization which is so central and so important to the things I'm saying tonight, and that is the Church of Satan, which was founded by Anton Szandor LaVey in 1966, which he declared the year zero, the year of Satan. He lived in San Francisco. He died in 1997. He was a very media-friendly figure. You probably would recognize pictures of him. He had a shaved head and a goatee, and he looked like Satan, and as we picture it in the popular mind. And he was a brilliant man. He was kind of a tricky man. He told a reporter from the Wall Street Journal in 1969 that he had played the figure of Lucifer in the movie Rosemary's Baby. And this keeps getting repeated over and over and over in the press. It was just repeated in the British newspaper The Independent a few months ago. Anton was nowhere near the set of Rosemary's Baby. He just invented the story. And the Wall Street Journal reporter accepted it, printed it, and everybody thinks, well, it's in the Wall Street Journal. It must be true. But it's also probably true that Anton's aesthetic and his reframing of the satanic as a religion of self-development influenced writers like Ira Levin and the filmmaker Roman Polanski and the people who created the movie Rosemary's Baby. So I guess one could say that Anton told the truth in the form of a myth. He wasn't part of Rosemary's Baby, but his aesthetic and his outlook and his intellect probably informed the events and the visuals and the storytelling found within the movie. But I must say a special word of tribute to him because he was probably the first person in modern life, in our time, who put forth the idea of the satanic as an ethical and religious philosophy that the individual could really live by. And in his book, The Satanic Bible, which has probably sold well over 1 million copies at this point, teenage metalheads always buy it, and they're like, yeah, this is going to be awesome. What they find in his book is a paean to individualism and his own set of ethics, not much different from some of the things that William Blake writes about in Marriage of Heaven and Hell. In some regards, and there is truth to this, some people feel that Anton's point of view was in some regards a bastardization of Ayn Rand and Nietzsche. And there's some truth to that, but what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that? You know, the Satanic Bible is a book that's very easy to read, very enjoyable. The first couple of chapters of Paradise Lost, Michael Aquino's Diabolicon, these are very, very simple works. You'll be very surprised and you'll be very pleased, because I know when you go home tonight, you're going to be tired and it's going to start snowing later, and you might think to yourself, you know, I don't really have time to read Paradise Lost. But when you go and you look up some of these works, you'll discover to your pleasure that they're very stimulating and they're very, very simple. I mean, start with Lord Byron's Cain. It's just a model of simplicity and word economy. There's not a wasted word in it. I strongly believe that truth should be simple, and I don't believe that alluring ideas need to be complex or need to be weighted down with excessive vocabulary or excessive introductions either. I think one of the bad legacies that great lines of literature like Penguin Classics, for example, have visited upon our contemporary culture is these turgid, long introductions. You know, you can't imagine why you would want to read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein by the time you're done with the 60-page introduction. Just read it. She wrote it without an introduction. Is it really necessary to have that kind of an introductory statement? I believe very strongly in just diving right into things, So Anton LaVey was very simple in the things that he said and did for the most part. I mean, there were times where I think, and you'll discover this in your own journey based upon how far you want to go with this, there were times where I think Anton was excessively complex. But if you read his book, The Satanic Bible, it's a wonderful, wonderful popularization of Ayn Rand and Nietzsche. So if you don't really feel like reading all 1,338 pages of Atlas Shrugged, read the Satanic Bible, because you'll really get that same point of view in about 60 very sprightly written pages. Anton was an extraordinary figure. He's often derided as being a showman, a trickster, a media sensationalist, and he was all those things. It's absolutely true. I mean, he made up his past. His real name was Howard Levy, and he became Anton LaVey. And, you know, that kind of tells you everything you need to know. But at the same time, he was a performer. He was an entertainer. He never claimed that he wasn't a carny. You know, he had a trickster background, and that is the way it was. But he was also a very straightforward figure. And I admired him because he would provoke and he would push and he would press buttons. But if you read his philosophy, I think it's a very life-affirming, very humanistic philosophy. And although I'm really aware that he chose the name Church of Satan to be provocative, I also just so deeply appreciate the straightforwardness of it all. That's probably what inspired me to call this talk tonight, Satanism, the Dark Alternative, because I don't want to play games with people and sort of try to disguise what I'm getting across. You know, Satan is supposed to be the Lord of lies and the Lord of deception. Well, you know, if I was interested in deceiving anybody, I would have chosen some cute title for the talk rather than something very straightforward. And I think Anton had a way about him of combining showmanship with a great ingenuousness, Yes, you know, he mythologized his past, he mythologized his name. He would, you know, tell these mythical lies to reporters from the Wall Street Journal and so on. But he really did introduce into Western culture, once again, this idea that the satanic could be a philosophical and ethical path. Now, it's important for me, and I'm probably going to close on this in a little while and open us up to some questions and exchange. It's important for me to briefly address the media misrepresentations of Satanism and the false notion that there's this horrible cabal of child-sacrificing, cruel, death-worshipping, cannibalistic Satanists somehow out there throughout the course of Western history up to the present day. That is a complete myth. That is a complete and utter fantasy, and I give absolutely no quarter to it whatsoever. First of all, it's important to point out that before Anton LaVey founded the Church of Satan in 1966, there really was no satanic tradition in Western culture at all to speak of. You had individuals, rebellious figures, who made counter readings and esoteric readings of some of the foundational Western myths. Some of these very individualized rebellious readings came out in some of the literature that I've been talking about. There were people like the novelist J.K. Huysmans and others who wrote about black masses and other things, most of which were lurid, gothic, imaginary fantasies that they might have picked up from some self-styled, self-described satanic occultists at turn-of-the-century culture or 19th century culture or in some reaches of romantic culture. But in order for there to be a tradition that one can really speak of, there has to be a liturgy, there has to be a family tree, there has to be foundational literature, there has to be a congregation. None of this has been true in Satanism. Satanism is an anarchistic tradition. It's very, very important to understand that. It's an anarchistic tradition. There's no black mass. People can make that up. People can put it into a novel. Anton could say that and tell reporters from Newsweek and the Wall Street Journal that he's conducting a black mass, but he's coming up with his own ceremony. There's not some tradition that you can point to that goes back 2,000 years and, oh, this is exactly what Satanists have been doing, in the same way that you can point to traditions in Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, Christianity. It's not a tradition in those terms. It's never been. For the most part, charges of Satanism were directed by the early church fathers against the remaining bastions of pagan power in late antiquity because they wanted to define these people who were on their way to being vanquished as part of something evil and maleficent that military might, judicial might should be directed against. And if the pagan powers had won the struggle of ideas in late antiquity, they would have done the same thing to the church fathers. There's not good guys and bad guys. There's human nature. To some extent, it's true that the victors get to write history. And as the early church became more and more powerful, and as Christianity became the officially accepted religion of the Roman Empire, the fading pagan powers were described as demonic, as satanic. They were described in terms that they never would have applied to themselves. The irony for me in giving a talk like this tonight is that as a historian, I'm always defending pagan antiquity and various occult figures from charges that they're satanic because they never conceived of themselves that way, and yet I'm describing a counter-tradition, an esoteric tradition of Satanism that wouldn't make any sense at all to the persecutors because they're misapplying that label, and they have through history, to people that they essentially want to tell what to do. That's the central foible of human nature. It existed in antiquity, it exists today, it exists in me, it exists in all of us. Most of the time, Satanism throughout history has been a false charge that has been directed by victors against vanquished. And that was certainly true during the hundreds of years of witch crazes that swept through Europe, where countless numbers of women were accused of being witches, agents of Satan, and were killed. And this is still going on in the world today. I have a piece in the New York Times that you can look up called Witch Hunts, 21st Century Style, about the thousands of people around the world, very often children and women, on all continents, who are accused of some sort of a satanic witchcraft and are subjected to horrible physical violence. This is going on in West and Central Africa. It's going on in the Pacific, going on in Indonesia, in Papua New Guinea. There are instances in London, in New York City, where people are accused, very often women, of being agents of Satan, practicing demonic witchcraft, and they're killed, and violence is visited upon them in the most horrible way. In the vast majority of cases, there's nothing of any spiritual content, black magic, white magic, of any spiritual content going on. It's just predators leveling a charge against somebody as a pretext for violence. That's mostly the history of Satanism in our Western world. There was also this media sensation during the 1980s that there was a satanic panic sweeping the nation, that healthcare workers and daycare workers and preschool teachers were torturing kids and sacrificing them and inducting them into satanic cults. Complete falsehood. Not a fragment or thread of truth to it. And I can tell you for a fact that there were people, like many of us in this room, artistic, sensitive, capable, decent people who had these accusations leveled against them because, they wore black lipstick in the town of, Missoula, Montana, and they were targeted with these rumors and this absolute nonsense. I won't give any quarter to it whatsoever. It was complete falsehood, complete and utter falsehood. The overwhelming likelihood is that anybody who's into the satanic is almost exactly like the person sitting next to you. Yes, they have a proclivity for wearing black, which is a very positive sign, I am convinced. And they are of an artistic bent, sensitive, outsiders, misfits of the best kind. I'm sure everyone in this room is unified in having had some experience when being very young of feeling out of step, out of sorts, like a square peg. That's a wonderful thing. That's a wonderful thing. That's exactly what forges the sense of individuality in you, in me, in all of us. That's the great likelihood of who you'll meet on this very individualized path. So when people come to you and they talk about evil or possession or satanic abuse scandals or black masses or any of this stuff, where is this information from? What are their premises? Why should their definitions mean anything to you or to me? Most of the time, it's a set of hand-me-down ideas from books that they've never read, from articles that they've heard about somewhere, from rumors and stories that have been proffered in the form of gossip over social media or among friends, from entertainment that they assume has at its back some factual truth. It's fear, it's propaganda, and above all, it's just conventional thinking. It's just conventional thinking, which is exactly the thing from the earliest part of our culture that the Satanic and the Luciferian has been a countervailing force to. And this journey that I invite you into, again, it is exquisitely voluntary. It is exquisitely your own. It's a journey of discovery. And it all begins, or at least it has for me, with that question that I put to you earlier. What if I've been praying to the wrong God? Blake said, the same law for the ox and the lion is oppression. You may feel a terrific yearning in you for something that hasn't been satisfied by the conventional offerings that we are told represent the only valid choices in our society. So I offer this to you, another choice, an alternative choice, something for you to explore entirely on your own. And my deepest, deepest wish for everyone in this room is that you find something extraordinary, and that something builds and asserts your will, that which is creative, that which is productive, that which is self in you. And I wish you every good thing on this journey. Thank you. Thank you. So we have about 5-10 minutes for questions, exchange. Anybody have anything? Hey.
I'm on a different path.
Mm-hmm.
There's things that are very, very similar. So I just wanted to kind of just bring up two things
Sure.
that you mentioned in your talk. For one thing, serpent.
Mm-hmm.
The serpent in a lot of other religions is actually an initiatory entity.
Yes.
That represents wisdom, but that also initiates people into, for example, voodoo, into
Mm-hmm.
the religion. And the other thing, possession.
Mm-hmm.
Possession is actually, in certain religions, like voodoo,
Mm-hmm.
considered an ideal.
Yes,
It's actually
right,
the
right.
ultimate experience
Yes.
to get closer to the Creator or the Godhead,
Yes.
which I think is kind of interesting.
It is. It is. Yeah.
Right, you're bringing up things like fear and
Yeah,
your,
yeah.
one's interpretation or one's belief of God.
Yeah. Yeah.
But sometimes when one has a calling to walk a different path, their interpretation of the Creator or
Yes.
of God or the Godhead changes
Yes.
because they're forced to face their fears.
Yes.
One might call the dark side.
Yes.
So incorporating both
Yeah.
the darkness and the light and walking, having a foot in both worlds
Yeah. Yeah.
and working with both hands is another way, I think, of looking at it.
Yeah.
At least what you made me think of.
Yeah. I think that's beautifully put, and I'm reminded that within charismatic and Pentecostal Christianity, there is speaking of tongues, drinking of poisons, biting by snakes,